in my wildest dreams, because I think that the price of uranium is going north of 60 in the next 2 years, in my wildest dreams, Sprott is able to raise $1 billion with the uranium price still in the mid 40s, clean out the spot market in the 40s, and then everybody gets to enjoy, sort of a, well, a very handsome increase in price over the next couple of years.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining and welcome back to Wall Street Silver. Uranium is a hot topic right now, and to break it down is our guest, commodities investing legend, Rick Rule. Rick, it's great to see you.
It's a pleasure to be here with you, as always. Thank you.
So we heard you snuck across the border and made it to Vancouver.
I am. This is Vancouver in the background. I'm up from Anacortes, Washington. The Canadian officials, I guess, had a momentary lapse and decided to let us ugly Americans across the border for a while. So we're up here enjoying this beautiful city that is Vancouver.
Nice. So Rick, what is your price target for uranium? The incentive price to produce uranium is probably around $60 US. So at what price will you start getting cautious?
Well, there's two parts to that question. I believe that some of the junior uranium equities are already substantially ahead of themselves. I've had a hard time staying fully invested in the junior sector because the junior sector has run so hard so fast. I believe that uranium won't have to go up in price anymore after about $70. I think that $60 number is going to adjust higher because I think we're starting to see inflation in all parts of the supply chain, and new mine construction as well as consumables will be one. Will we get there this year? I doubt it. Mm-hmm. What I would note for your viewers, however, is that while I am near term very cautious about uranium equities, the smaller uranium equities, long term I'm pretty bullish. So you need to take everything that I say in the context of time. One thing that the last uranium bull market taught me is that prices overshoot to the upside and the downside. These are capital-intensive cyclical businesses. And even though the incentive price of uranium can go above the price that's necessary to bring new production online, it takes a lot of time for that to work its way through the market. A greenfields discovery made now, depending on where it was made, might not be put in production for 10 or 15 years. But even the restart of well-maintained deferred projects like McArthur River, Cigar, the big chemical projects, can take 2 to 2.5 years to restart. On top of that, the fuel cycle, the process by which finished uranium is converted into nuclear fuel, can take as much as 12 months. Because of that, although the incentive price for uranium might be $60, it wouldn't surprise me in a shortage to see the price go higher than that. I remember in the last uranium bull market, I remember thinking when uranium was about $10 a pound, I think this cycle uranium could go to 40. I was wrong. It went to 140. Now, I'm not suggesting that the overshoot would be of the same order of magnitude, but I would say that I think that uranium has the possibility to surprise old skeptics like me to the upside. I don't think it's going to surprise necessarily the Reddit crowd. I've seen predictions among Reddit users of $200 or $300 a pound. Now, that would certainly surprise me, I must say. But, in my declining years, guys, I sort of hope for the best and expect the worst. And the consequence of that is that I'm seldom disappointed.
Well, you just brought up Reddit, and our own Happy Hawaiian just wrote this the other day on Wall Street Bets, and it got a lot of play, a lot of upvotes here, thousands of views, where he basically explained what the Sprott Uranium Physical Trust is. And the comments, there's literally hundreds and hundreds of comments about Wall Street Bets, and there's other discussions all over this forum about various uranium mining stocks that they're all looking at right now. And It's definitely sparked a lot of discussion among the traders there, and I never would have thought. Are you surprised by the response you've seen among
I'm not.
the traders?
We had you may remember that we had a discussion a couple of episodes or a couple of interviews back about the fact that your audience was very narrative oriented. In fact, the whole young speculative investment community is fairly narrative oriented. And there's no more powerful narrative that I know of than the uranium narrative. Mm-hmm. The younger audience seemed absolutely to get the sense that if you make the stuff for $60 a pound and you sell it for $30 a pound, that can't go on for too long. Mm-hmm. And many of the technologically focused young people understood that even in a society as rich as the United States, where the powers that be might prefer, wind and solar, that 20% of baseload power in the country was nuclear. Mm-hmm. I've had the good fortune to be quoted a lot in those discussions from a quote I made about 2 years ago, which said that society really had a choice between the price of uranium going up or the lights going out. Mm-hmm. And that decision point had to be reached within 5 or 6 years of 2 years ago. It's pretty clear that most people thought that the price of uranium would go up, that didn't think the price, that the lights would go out. Yeah. And I think that this whole younger class of investors who mercifully, I think for them, get their information and their paradigm from thousands of sources rather than having it delivered to them by their government, by academia, by the big investment banks, have a receptiveness to ideas like this that hasn't necessarily characterized older classes of investors.
Well, that raises the point, keeping the lights on. Is the uranium investment thesis mostly a recognition by, let's call it the Greens, that political or that ideological class, that nuclear is really the only baseload option within their realm? Obviously, coal and other things work for baseload, but within their politically accepted ideology, nuclear is really the only way to keep the lights on and still maintain any sort of standard of living. Is that the investment thesis going forward for uranium?
I think that's an investment thesis. I don't think it's widely supported through the sort of depth of the green movement. I think many parts of the green movement are actually Luddite. They would prefer that we lowered our standard of living. Mm-hmm. But I think that more responsible members of the green community, Bjorn Lornberg as an example from the Copenhagen Consensus, has been very vocal about the need for baseload power that isn't carbon generating. And I think there's been a greater consensus among more elements of society that nuclear is, first of all, an important existing source of baseload power, but also is an important part of the world's electricity growth. Mm-hmm. The emerging and frontier market participants in the Paris Climate Accords and their successors have pointed out that although the largest recent increase in carbon generation has come from frontier and emerging markets like China and India, mm-hmm. that those countries are very low emitters on a per capita basis, mm-hmm. And also are responsible for very little of the historic generation of carbon, which is still in the atmosphere. And to the extent that places like China and India and Brazil have the right to attain standards of living that are similar to the ones that you and I enjoy, which they certainly aspire to, that their loadings of carbon are going to continue to increase. Mm-hmm. And if you understand the problem in that context, it's very clear that if we are going to have any chance of meeting the carbon accords, and I don't want to get into a discussion about the efficacy of the carbon accords, but if you decide that we are going to meet those standards, that there is no way mm-hmm. for inhabitants of emerging and frontier markets to enjoy the same energy intensive lifestyle that we all enjoy. And I find it difficult to believe that they don't have the rights to those same standards if they can achieve them.
Well, there was just the other day, I happened to notice this. Illinois, which normally they were pushing to shut down these nuclear power plants in Illinois for the longest time. And the government there just finally realized if we shut down these, I think there's 6 of them in Illinois. If we shut these down early, basically they're going to be replaced by natural gas. And they just rushed this through to give them all sorts of, extensions to basically extend their life. And immediately then the power supplier starts the process of extending their licenses. But I'm just seeing that over and over again. Regions that have been fighting against these things for years are now coming around to what you just said. We have to keep them on. We have to, and the next generation of nuclear power plants aren't ready yet. They're still some years away. We got to keep the lights on until then.
I think that's an American story.
Yeah.
The bigger story, I think, for uranium prices is the fact that the political winds have changed in Japan. For the last 3 years, I've been saying you're going to see an increase in the uranium price when the pace of Japanese restarts kicks up. You'll recall that Japan had either the 2nd or 3rd largest nuclear fleet in the world, depending on how you count, after the United States, until Fukushima. And then 42 plants went offline, pardon me. They've restarted 8 plants, but I believe that the source of most of the fuel overhang in the market for the last 7 years has been the estimated 40 million pounds in Japan that isn't being used for nuclear power. To the extent that you restart those plants, you at once increase demand and you eliminate supply in the spot market. The catalyst for the uranium price in the near term has not been the pace of Japanese restarts. It has certainly been the Sprott Physical Uranium Trust, which changed the supply and demand balance simply by adding demand, which had been absent for the market. But a more important development over the next 2 years, I think, will be the pace of Japanese restarts, where it would seem that a political willingness on the part of Japanese voters to re-embrace nuclear power will allow the Japanese politicians and business interests who have always been in favor of nuclear power to begin the process of restarting those plants. And I can't overemphasize that. I think that Sprott's achievements in changing the nuclear power and the spot price equation.
Yeah, that's fine. Sprott price. That's because
the spot price equation has been interesting in the last month. But I think that a restart of the Japanese fleet would really, truly be the thing that would restore the uranium market to balance.
Can you give me a rough estimate of how much? I saw online the initial filing was for 300 million for the Sprott Uranium Trust. It was just extended by another $1 billion, which was finally started yesterday because there was such a huge premium. I was like 28%, and then it came down to 8% yesterday, the premium over NAV. But how much of this, let's say, how much of the global supply is Sprott vacuuming up right now?
Well, nobody, one of the difficult things about uranium, and I've been saying this in interviews for 5 years, the market is so opaque, it's very difficult to tell how much supply and in what form is out there. What I can tell you is that volumes in the spot market were pretty constrained. The only producers who really could economically access the spot market were Kazatomprom and BHP from Olympic Dam, which produces uranium as a byproduct of other metals. So supplies on the spot market were either trader supplies or, in my belief, they were Japanese inventories. We had estimated internally that the Japanese inventories were about 40 million pounds. But I need to say that I have no idea how accurate that was. The Japanese were not particularly forthcoming, despite my smiles. What I can say is this: we have changed the dynamic of the spot market because all of a sudden there's a bid. And there is a big bid. As you point out, when Sprott filed the normal course, not the normal course, pardon me, the at the market facility, they put up a $300 million ask on the back of a $50 million financing that they did before the ATM. So really there has been $350 million to deploy. Sprott ran into a couple problems early. The first was that the appearance of a bid on the market and their aggressive purchases, as is required by their articles of incorporation, chewed up the available inventory in the low 30s on the spot market, and the price began to move up. I think fed interest in the product itself. More money came into the trust. But what began to happen is that supplies in the mid 30s and high 30s began to disappear too. And I don't know this, I think that Sprott ran into a problem where they were raising money faster than they could deploy it in the spot market. The consequence of that is that they had to slow down their acquisitions, which meant that they slowed down new unit creation, which means that the premium, because they weren't monetizing them with an AUM, began to increase, which is not something that Sprott has ever wanted. Sprott doesn't want to sell at a 30% premium because the idea is to have the trust accurately reflect the state of the uranium market.
Yeah.
Sprott, I think, believes, and I know that many investors believe, that the Sprott product will be enormously more liquid than the spot market. So that in effect, the Sprott market, if that's the right pun, will become a more accurate reflection of the true state of the market than what is commonly referred to as the spot market. My suspicion is that now that we're up in the 40s, some holders of inventory who saw the price go up and felt that $32 or $33 wasn't a sufficient price for them to hit the bid will begin to feel comfortable in the mid 40s. And I'm hoping that supply and demand will even out here. In my wildest dreams, because I think that the price of uranium is going north of 60 in the next 2 years, in my wildest dreams, Sprott is able to raise $1 billion with the uranium price still in the mid 40s, clean out the spot market in the 40s, and then everybody gets to enjoy, sort of a, a very handsome increase in price over the next couple of years.
Now, Rick, do you think what we seen from Sprott a few weeks ago, was it a trigger for uranium, or do we have to wait until they list in the US next year? If they even list.
I would have said that we would have to wait till they listed in the US. I think I said that on your show. That turns out to have been an enormous error. Americans somehow found their way north of the 49th parallel. By the way, there are still numerous brokerage firms in the United States that won't allow Americans to buy the Sprott product because they consider it to be a foreign stock. I think that listing on the New York Stock Exchange will greatly increase the volume in the Sprott product. As best Sprott can tell, over 90% of the trading volume in its other metals trusts, the gold and silver and platinum and palladium trusts, take place in US markets. The vast majority of the 280,000 investors who own Sprott listed physical trusts are in fact American. And so I think that to the extent that Sprott is successful in listing the product, which they hope to do in the calendar first quarter 2022, I think that will greatly increase liquidity in the product, and by proxy, greatly increase liquidity in the uranium market.
So, Sprott's known for producing those silver coins with Sprott stamped on them. Are you going to do the same thing for uranium and let people stack uranium at home?
You'll notice that on our physical silver product, we have a redemption feature. We have decided, in the interests of our shareholders' well-being, not to make the uranium product redeemable.
Oh, that's too bad. If you can't hold it, do you really own it? Or your highly enriched weapons grade uranium. So is the plan to hold the uranium forever, or will you allow at some point, at some point nuclear power companies are saying, hey, Sprott, you've taken everything, we need to refuel. Is there maybe going to be a redemption feature for qualified consumers? I don't know.
Two scenarios worth considering. The first would be that the trust began to sell at a discount at some point in time to the net asset value of its holdings rather than a premium. In that circumstance, it might be in everyone's interest to sell some fuel and use the money to redeem units, buy back in units, thereby increasing the uranium holdings of the remaining holders. But going all the way back to the founding of Sprott by Eric Sprott, the organization has always tried to do what is in their investors' best interests. At some point in time, if the uranium business got really, really, really short, and somebody, in order to get their hands on what would by then perhaps be the most strategic stake in the uranium business, I suspect if somebody bid us a premium because they needed to, that would benefit all investors, that Sprott would have to look very carefully at that. Certainly as a director of Sprott and one who is interested in the value of the franchise, to the extent that there was an opportunity to monetize the trust all at once to the benefit of all holders, we would have to look very carefully at that. This is all speculation on my part.
So, but fuel is a very minor component of the cost of electricity generated by nuclear power plants. It's like, I mean, natural gas or coal, much bigger proportionally the fuel cost. It's my understanding the actual fuel cost in nuclear is like 2% or something of the total cost. So them paying a premium is negligible, correct?
That's a very important point. And I don't want to say what they're going to do, but it is important to note that uranium is an extremely dense, extremely efficient fuel. And in truth, if you have spent $6 billion to build a nuclear power plant and you're spending $250 or $300 million a year on regulation and compliance, if that plant is using 1 million pounds of fuel a year, it turns out that the proportion of your total cost and expense represented by fuel is fairly insignificant. If in order to operate a $6 billion facility, you need to spend $40 million for fuel, the answer is yes. Yeah. If you need to spend $80 million for fuel, the answer is yes. And if you need to spend $120 million a year for fuel, the answer is still yes.
Yeah, exactly.
What we saw in the last uranium bull market, where the uranium price went from $8 a pound to $140 a pound, is that demand for uranium is extremely inelastic relative to price.
Well, have you gotten any hate mail from any CEOs of nuclear power companies?
I would suspect, I'm not speaking for Sprott now, I'm speaking for Rick Rule. I would suspect that our application for listing on the New York Stock Exchange will run into some opposition from uranium traders because we've eliminated the carry trade for them. I mean, that went to trade heaven. And we've tightened a market where utilities, despite the fact that fuel isn't an important cost component, we've certainly eliminated their ability to run their fuel cycle from the spot market as opposed to from the term market. Now, I happen to believe that we've performed a service for the utilities, because the truth is that an industry that makes the stuff for 60 and sells it for 30 is unsustainable. And it's in the utilities' long-term interest to agree to 5 or 6 or 10-year contracts that make the mining industry viable at the same time that they stabilize the price of fuel for the utilities. The utilities were less interested in the long-term viability of the industry than they were getting bargain fuel. I understand that. But I believe, in fact, that Sprott has done all comers a favor in this circumstance.
Yeah. Are you personally an investor in the Sprott Uranium Physical Trust?
I am. I, as a Sprott employee, which I no longer am, but as a Sprott employee, I would normally be restricted. But before it became the Sprott Physical Uranium Trust, when it was Uranium Participation Corp, and Sprott had announced its intention to take control, I was able to buy some without restriction.
Is it fair to say that the trust's impact has so far exceeded your wildest expectations? And is $65 a pound sustainable long term?
not speaking for Sprott, speaking for Rule, it has absolutely exceeded my wildest expectations. I wouldn't have believed that the volumes that we achieved on the Toronto Stock Exchange would be anywhere near the volumes that we've experienced. If I had understood the volumes that we enjoyed on the Toronto Stock Exchange, then I would have anticipated the impact that we've had in the spot market, because I knew that the spot market was A, opaque, and B, extremely thin. It is my honest hope that the escalation in prices in the spot market begins to stabilize, that more fuel comes on the market in the mid 40s, and that Sprott is able to access another $1 billion at the market and clean up the available inventories in the spot market in the low 40s rather than in the high 50s. In other words, I'd like this to take longer rather than less time. And I'd very, very, very much like to see Sprott be able to acquire 20, 25 million pounds here.
Gotcha. Let me share one thing from Wall Street Bets here. You have gotten Wall Street Bets talking about uranium stocks now. Are there any in the mining stocks? And because I think they're more interested in those as opposed to the underlying commodity. They're looking for more, action.
Sure.
Are there any specific mining stocks that you feel comfortable chatting about today?
I don't like to give tips to people in the sense that I don't know what's appropriate to their portfolios. I can tell you that in terms of my own portfolio, I prefer the value names. So my favorite name is easily Kazatomprom, which is the largest and lowest cost and finest uranium producer in the world. Some people can't trade stocks in London. Some people don't want to own Kazakh stocks. But if you want a quality uranium stock, I don't think that there's any substitute for Kazatomprom. I was quoted earlier on a different show, yours, by the way, as saying that I also like China General Nuclear. That was at a 50% lower share price. And Cameco, which was also at a 50% lower share price. I have been a net seller of the uranium juniors again for the last 4 or 5 days because I think they're ahead of themselves.
Yeah.
We, Aditya Patanayak, who you might know, a young, very, very, very smart broker who works for Sprott, has compiled a list of 63 uranium stocks worldwide, about 15 more than I knew existed. And he and I did some work on preliminary economic assessments and bankable feasibility studies, pre-feasibility studies. And it would appear that the universe of developers is discounting $50 or $60 uranium now. Now, that doesn't mean that as a consequence of something like fear of missing out, that the stocks can't continue to outpace the yellow cake. It also doesn't mean that the yellow cake won't go higher. And furthermore, it doesn't mean that some of the little tiny uranium companies couldn't get lucky and make a discovery. What it does mean is that relative to the current price of uranium, in the low 40s, that the uranium equities are ahead of themselves. So I'm in an odd circumstance in an interview like this. I have been, I think, the longest standing popular commentator advocating the uranium trade. Admittedly, I was early, yeah. 3.5 years early. I believe that 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, the price of the decent quality uranium stocks will be higher than they are now, 100 or 200% higher than they are now. It wouldn't surprise me, however, in the next 6 months or 12 months to see those same stocks substantially lower. I think the analog that we see is in the gold and silver stocks. We are clearly in the late part of the early innings of a gold and silver stock bull market, but we've been in a hiatus around the equities for 12 months. Many of the equity indexes, the mid-cap indexes, the developer indexes are off by 25 or 30%. So it wouldn't surprise me at all to see that sort of retracement in the silver market. I'm not saying it's going to happen.
Or the uranium market.
The uranium market. I'm sorry, the uranium market.
We've had enough of silver going down. Just had to correct that one.
Well, yeah. I mean, I hope we have time in this interview to talk about silver.
We're
because
talking. That's my next question.
I'm becoming much more bullish about that trade.